If you clicked on this video, you're probably curious about what it's like to delete your social media. And that's why I'm here to tell you about my experience and how my life has changed since I stopped using it. I found that there are about 1,000 things that I'd rather be doing than scrolling through my phone, like enjoying the little things, exploring, dipping my feet into the ocean, seeing nature, watching sunsets, having interesting conversations, finding beautiful architecture and scenery, trying something new, going on drives, spending time with the people I really care about, reading, writing, creating, laughing with my friends, appreciating the world around me, and just being happy. And that's why I think you should delete your social media too.
Hey guys, what's up? It's Noemi, and today I'm going to be talking about something that I've been wanting to talk about for so long because I feel super passionate about it and I feel like it has made such a positive change in my life. And that thing is deleting my social media. The reason I've been wanting to talk about this is because I recently watched The Social Dilemma, which was a fantastic documentary. It got me going down this rabbit hole of researching information about social media and some of its problematics and some of its downsides. I just became super fascinated. There's so much good information out there, but I don't hear a lot of people talking about it. And although I intend this video to be for everyone, because this is a problem for every generation, I think it's especially important for people in Gen Z, my generation, to start talking about it because we're the ones who have grown up with this technology and we are also the ones who are going to be dealing with the consequences in our adulthood. So this is going to be a very multifaceted video. I wanted to include my personal story with quitting social media, specifically Instagram, because that was my biggest addiction, and then sort of go on and give you guys some of the information that I've been learning recently, just sort of make this video to help inspire people to delete their social media accounts, to give people the strength and the companionship to feel that they're ready to do it. And if you're not ready to do it, at least be informed about it. I think being aware is super, super important. So if this does not apply to you, I still think it's really worthwhile to listen to the information and just think about it. Let it sit with you. I really hope this is helpful. I know it's not a book-related video, and that's really what I've started my channel on, but I'm hoping that this will have sort of a larger scope because I think it's a really important thing to be talking about right now. Here we go. I'm already rambling. So this is my story. I got my first Instagram account in the 7th grade. I was the new kid at school because my family had just come back from a sabbatical. My dad was teaching in Europe, and I had basically come into middle school in the middle of the year, not knowing anyone in a new town, feeling very out of place. I sensed that there was this hierarchy at my new school, but I didn't really know what to make of it. It wasn't like anything I had ever experienced before. I realized that I was actually sort of at the bottom of it. Nobody really knew who I was. I wore weird clothes that my family scavenged from garage sales and Goodwill. I made a few friends. I started sort of observing people. I realized that all of the cool kids at school had social media accounts, and so I made one. And I wanted to figure out what they had that I didn't, what they were doing that I wasn't doing. And so through social media, I just sort of noticed what people were wearing, what the popular girls were doing, what captions they were using, how they were talking to each other, what memes they were referencing, how their hair looked, what makeup they used. And I started imitating them. I started to try to implement that sense of humor that I was noticing into my own language and my vocabulary. Everything was changing based on what I was seeing on social media, and of course in the real world too, but I think there was a sort of convergence there between what was going on at school and what was going on social media. I basically studied people and then copied them, and that was how I began to feel at home at my school and in my community. I began to feel like I was a part of something bigger than myself. I had some followers, probably like less than 50 at that point, but I was gaining and gaining, and as I went through the rest of middle school and the beginning of high school, I decided that this was going to be a priority for me. It wasn't a conscious decision, but I knew that fitting in and being liked was really important. And I know that that's sort of a common thing for adolescents, especially in middle school. But I especially, having come into this new community as an outsider, felt like I had something to prove. In high school, I started hanging out with a different group of friends, got a job as soon as humanly possible so I could pay for my own clothes. And I spent all my money on a car and clothes so that I could fit in. And I started spending a lot of time curating my image on Instagram. I was seeing what popular girls at my school looked like, and I was doing more and more to make myself look like them through my phone lens. I was editing my pictures. I was using those beautifying apps that, you know, take away the blemishes off your face and even add makeup artificially. And I was posing in ways that I saw girls on Instagram posing. All stuff that you've heard before, but I feel like this is a good place to start for this conversation, is just letting you know how I got to where I got. So I was really invested in social media. I thought I loved it, but really when I spent time on it, I would get really depressed because I would compare myself to girls that I thought were prettier than me, or I'd see people at my school having fun and going to parties that I wasn't invited to. The problem was it just all felt like one big competition. And I realized that even once I started doing well in the competition relatively, I never felt like I was enough. I never got enough likes. When I first started my Instagram in middle school, I dreamed about getting 1,000 followers. And then in high school, my sophomore year, I got 1,000 followers on Instagram. But that wasn't enough because there was other girls at my school who had 3,000 followers on Instagram. And so of course, you never get that feeling of satisfaction that you think you're going to get. And so I kept trying. I would go on photo shoots with my friends where the sole purpose of us hanging out was to get pictures and videos and boomerangs for Instagram or for various platforms. We got all dressed up, we put on makeup, I'd post it and I'd get 300 likes, and I'd realize that another girl had gotten 400. It was never enough. It was a competition that I could never win. I feel like my experience is pretty representative of like a Gen Z person's experience, at least at my age. I didn't know anyone at my school who didn't have a social media. I flirted with the idea of deleting it all because I think I was semi-aware of what was going on and that I was super addicted and that I was prioritizing this over other things. I should mention that when I was younger, I was a precocious reader and I loved school. And then in high school, at least at the beginning, my grades dropped and I got C's because all I was worried about was hanging out with friends, being more popular, climbing this ladder, and virtually having that curated image of me look better and better. I realize now that I had digested the standard of beauty that is completely unattainable and unrealistic. At 16, I posted this photo of myself in a bikini because I was taught that this was what was valued on social media, not anything that I could do or create, not my creative endeavors, but how I looked. I'd also post sometimes photography that I had taken because that was something I was really passionate about at the time. The picture of the landscape that I took would get 1/3 of the likes as the picture I posted of myself in the bikini posing in that hyper-sexualized manner. I think that's just so problematic in so many ways. And we've seen the numbers. Depression for teenage girls and even suicidal tendencies have grown exponentially. Eating disorders have grown. And so that's sort of one big problem with social media. Now, what made me quit? I can't say exactly what it is, but when I was in college, I just sort of had this turning point. I had stopped posting for a while at the beginning of college because I was going through a pretty difficult time in my life and I just didn't really feel like sharing anything. And then after I stopped posting, I was still using social media, but I realized that what I was getting out of it was pretty much just wasting my time. I was getting that feeling of having my addiction satiated very temporarily, but I wasn't getting even the love or the artificial likes that I was getting when I was posting. And so after a period of sort of dormant social media, I ended up just trying to delete it. Actually, I started with all the other apps. So I think I got rid of my Snapchat, my Twitter, my Facebook, and then I still had my Instagram. And then I decided to just temporarily disable my account, which basically looks like deleting it to anyone else. You won't come up in search results and no one can see your profile anymore, but Instagram still stores all of that data so you can come back to it later. And also, this is funny to mention, but when you go to delete your Instagram account, Instagram asks you like 20 times, are you sure? Are you sure you don't want to just temporarily disable it? Please don't leave. And it's actually really hard to get past those blocks, and they do that so that you'll keep using their platform, but it's kind of pathetic how hard it was. But to go back to my point, about a year and a half ago, I think it was in March of 2019, so I'm coming up on 2 years of sobriety from social media. I temporarily disabled my account on Instagram for probably 4 to 5 months, and then I ended up just doing the big delete. And it's incredible how much time I've saved and how much happier I am. Self-esteem is a big problem, especially for girls, and infinite scroll sucks up your time. You guys have heard this all before, but I think there's a lot more to this story. I wanted to give you guys a sort of rundown of what my experience was like and tell you that here I am a year and a half, almost 2 years later, and I am so happy. I feel so much more focused, and I feel like I have goals that I'm able to achieve much easier. And a lot of people ask me if I miss the connections and if, I sort of drifted away from people because I don't have Instagram anymore and I don't see, my old high school acquaintances and classmates and stuff. And the answer is no, because the people that truly matter to me text me and call me and FaceTime me and ask me to hang out. Obviously not during COVID times, but other than that, the people that really matter in my life, they're still in my life. The people that didn't really matter in my life aren't, and it doesn't matter. And that's like the great thing about deleting your social media, is that it kind of narrows your circle of people, but it feels a lot more wholesome and natural. Because, before social media, you kept your circle to the minimum that was really practical in your life, and you'd keep up with people if that connection was important to you. You'd prioritize it. And so social media got rid of the need to prioritize relationships, but I still think that that's such a valuable thing. And I think it comes back to just time and attention. Ask yourself, does it make you happy? Is it genuinely improving your life? Or are you just on it because you're addicted? And if you are, that's fine. I was there for years and years, stuck in that addiction, and I couldn't imagine deleting it, and deleting it was ridiculously hard. But that's how good these platforms are at making you addicted. You are sort of in denial about it, and you come up with reasons why you can't, because you'll lose contact with your old friends, or because it's actually pretty educational. But I think there's other better ways to maintain connection and be educated. And the internet has done a lot of wonderful things, but some of these apps are not. Self-esteem is a big problem, especially for girls, and infinite scroll sucks up your time. You guys have heard this all before, but I think there's a lot more to this story. So, like I mentioned, I watched The Social Dilemma on Netflix, and if you have not watched it, please watch it. It is so good, and I think they did a wonderful job of mixing actual acting with a documentary style film, because you get a lot of information, but it's still very digestible and still really engaging. So go watch it if you've not watched it yet. And if you have watched it, I'm gonna give you a lot of other pieces of homework that you can do if you want to become more aware of what's going on, because although I think The Social Dilemma is a really good place to start, I had a lot of unanswered questions at the end of it, and so I think there are some other resources that you can go to where you'll find a lot more really interesting information. One of the most important tenets that I learned from The Social Dilemma was, if you're not paying for the product, then you are the product. And I didn't really know what this meant at first. It took me a couple of times of hearing it to really understand, but basically, most social media is free to use, and we think that's a great thing because equality is really important, and some people might have money to spare to spend on social media, but other people don't, and so we want internet to be equally accessible to all people, ideally, but the companies still have to make money somehow. And the way they make money is through advertisers who pay the platforms to show ads. And so you'll notice on Instagram there's ads, and YouTube, obviously you're seeing this video, they're personally tailored to you and your interests and what advertisers might think you'll be willing to buy. And I've had conversations with my friends about this, and my friends are always kind of like, yeah, I see those ads on TikTok or Instagram, but I've never actually bought something I've seen an ad for. And that may be true. I've always sort of agreed with that notion as well. But if it didn't work, they wouldn't be pouring so much money into it. And so what they're really paying for is these tiny, almost subconscious changes in your behavior. So maybe it's not as direct and clear cut as you saw an ad for Clorox and then you went the next day to the store and you bought Clorox wipes, but tiny, tiny, tiny incremental changes in your behavior. Because I think we're a lot more influenced by our subconscious mind than we give credit to ourselves for, I guess, or than we acknowledge. And it turns out that these changes are highly predictable in human beings, and that's why companies are paying so much money. There are a lot of different types of platforms that are all competing for your attention. YouTube is just as much competing for your attention as Instagram is. The more you engage with these platforms, the more money they make. And so they're incentivized to basically steal your time and attention away from you, which is pretty evil if you think about it. I mean, it wouldn't be bad if you knew what was going on, but the problem is, I think 90% of people, or even more, are completely unaware of that happening. They think, oh, whatever, I see an ad, I get the platform for free, it's not a big deal. But they are literally stealing seconds that add up to minutes, that add up to hours of your life, and on top of that, they're manipulating you to buy products. and perpetuate consumerism. So think about it like social media is selling you because you're not buying social media. I'm actually sort of into the idea because I don't think social media is going away. I'm not one of those people who is like Amish and wants to go off into the woods and not use electronic devices anymore. I think just social media platforms have to change their business model. But because that may not happen right away, it might take some time, I think one big step to take is getting off of them and educating yourself. But I think the next business model really is going to have to be that people pay so that there's no ads. So if you paid $10 a month or $15 a month for Instagram and you don't see ads, or the same for YouTube, I think that would be really worth it for people, because then it takes away the need for those platforms to be sponsored by companies, and it makes the whole experience a lot more authentic, in my opinion. So I think that's kind of gonna have to be the next step. But until that point, I think it's really important that people know about this and that they start being responsible for their own sake, just so that you live a happier, healthier life. And I wanted to tell people that for me, this made a huge difference in my mental health. So putting that aside, it's kind of interesting to note the different little clever ways that platforms get your attention. And so TikTok's really good at doing this, because TikTok, as soon as you open the app, it plays you a video immediately and you didn't even have to search anything. And so another aspect that is very problematic with social media is the algorithm. And so with TikTok, the algorithm's suited to you and apparently is like a proprietary thing, and it will give you exactly what you want, but it's also giving you exactly what will keep you on the app for the longest amount of time and keep you engaged. And so the fact that your autonomy as a person is kind of being taken away by a supercomputer, Tristan Harris from the documentary, he makes the analogy of a supercomputer is basically pointed at your brain. And it's not even scientists controlling you, it's this algorithm. And it's getting you to spend your time on an app where you normally wouldn't. It happens to me even now on YouTube, because YouTube is pretty much the only social media that I still have, that I still use. And I'll go on to search for something and I want to efficiently get to that video that I'm searching for, but I'll see the recommended list and I'll be like, oh, I'm so interested, and I'll forget exactly what I was trying to look for in the first place, which is super problematic because my time is being taken away from me and my autonomy is kind of being taken away from me, because in the end, as human beings, we're basically just animals and we have very animalistic behaviors and instincts, and we follow those instincts. So on TikTok, when we open up the app and it plays us exactly what we want, and then it plays the next video and the next video, we're gonna keep watching. And it's the same with YouTube, their like recommended side, which again, I don't think is super great. And I understand there's a huge hypocrisy here, because here I am on YouTube making a video, but I will address that later, because I think there are platforms that have redemptive qualities, and YouTube is one of them. Also, another fun fact about TikTok, they figured out that what everyone wants is to become famous. And so they basically made it easier and more plausible for people to achieve that on their app. And again, Tristan, who I mentioned, calls it winning the fame lottery. And this capacity for TikTok to give people what they really want is really good at keeping them on the app and keeping people coming back to it, because you can literally go from 0 followers to like 1 million followers in a week or a week and a half. And that's what we as teenagers on Instagram, when I was on it, dreamed about, but it would have been nearly impossible. And so the creators of TikTok fixed that problem and made it really easy for teenagers or anyone to get on. Funny, I have a friend who is actually on TikTok and he got famous pretty quickly, but that's completely out of the blue. I won't shout him out in this video since it's all about how much I hate social media, but I still love my friend. Anyways, basically, TikTok is even more addictive for its capacity to give you that feeling of validation quickly, of gaining followers and gaining likes and whatnot. I don't even know what it's called. I'm such a grandma. Is it followers on TikTok? I don't know. Okay, so it's basically like a slot machine in Vegas. Like, you're always opening up the app wondering, what likes will I get? What followers will I get? And because it's different every time, even if one day you don't have that many likes, there's always that hope that you want to be fulfilled with more likes next time. And so it's that addictive, like, devil's cycle. There's all of these possibilities, and that makes it so irresistible. Another issue with social media is the conspiracy theories that it harbors and it sort of facilitates. And this is a larger problem with the internet as a whole, but I think specifically social media, because of how much it's shortened our attention spans. And with things like Twitter, we're so used to digesting just very small amounts, and the most snappy, exciting, scary thing that will grab our attention. You hear this talked about a lot in like Hollywood, like celebrity culture, but sound bites and clickbait headlines, things getting taken out of context. And I think it's because people can't help but pay attention to extreme things that grab their attention, like a car accident on the side of the road. Everyone's going to stop and stare because it's human nature. And it's just the same crazy things on social media. So there was this one part of a podcast that I listened to with Tristan Harris and Joe Rogan, which I will link, and it is such a good podcast. I think it was actually much more informational than The Social Dilemma was, because they go a lot more in depth. And so if you're interested, I highly recommend listening to that because I learned so much. But there's one part where they talk about young girls who look up dieting videos on YouTube. Because YouTube, the algorithm wants to give whoever's watching the thing that's most exciting in their recommended. Often it'll go from like a dieting video to like an anorexia video, or like a thin-spiration video, they call it. And so it's always trying to give you that next level of adrenaline or dopamine or whatever it is that makes us look at car accidents on the side of the road. It's trying to give us that virtually. And so this is really problematic because it heightens the content that we're watching, and oftentimes the content's not filtered well, it's not regulated, and so we get content that's not true. Fact regulation for what they were watching. They could have easily been watching flat earth videos or anti-vax videos and all sorts of conspiracy theories that were teaching them things that were factually false. And this actually happens like a lot of the time. And not only young kids and teenagers and people whose minds are still developing, but it happens to everyone. I think a huge segment of the population is highly vulnerable to disinformation, and I am not excluded from that. I think we all are to a certain extent, but some can go even further than others, as we've seen with the whole chemtrails, 5G towers, Q conspiracy, problems with the COVID vaccine, which is totally fine. And I get it because it's new. So I think that's kind of an exception. If you're thinking critically about that, that's probably a good thing. But there's been no scientific evidence that has pointed to it being problematic, and yet there's all these theories about why it's going to be the government controlling us through a chip that they inject through the COVID vaccine, which is, you know, just ridiculous. And there's even stuff like Holocaust denier videos. I mean, these things, it's like a wild jungle that's completely unregulated. And it's gotten really out of control because the algorithm is what's deciding who sees what video and what information each person sees. And I think that's really the problem, is that the algorithm values attention, and the things that are attention grabbing are often, to be candid, crazy. And so even if you personally aren't vulnerable to this, I bet you that there's people in your life that are. And so I think it's a problem to be taken seriously. It used to be that journalists and editors were paid to write and share news that was fact-checked and credible, and they'd get big salaries for it. But now we can all share our political opinions online, and we'll do it for free, happily. And basically, whoever's voice is the loudest and the craziest, that's the person who wins and gets their voice heard, and everyone else gets sort of drowned out. So the same principle applies. The craziest, loudest, most irrational person is the person who gets people's attention, because right now on the internet and on social media across all platforms, we are living in this attention economy where our attention is bought and sold, and the people who are the best at grabbing our attention are oftentimes the craziest, the wildest, and they're not being fact-checked, and I think that's really important. And at the same time, equally as problematic is that everybody's lost faith in the institution of national news media, because, you know, there's all this talk about liberal bias, which I'm sure is true to a certain extent, but how can we continue to function in a society where we can't agree on the most basic level of what is true? I mean, just having conversations in this past year with family and friends and people who disagree on political stuff, it is so hard to navigate because we're all just spouting different facts, but nobody actually knows what facts are, because on social media, text is all valued in the same way. How do we know if something that random person said was true or false? It was kind of something that the founders of these platforms didn't think about, and it's really gotten us into trouble in a big way. And we've seen that come to fruition with our politics recently, which has just been devastating. On both sides of the aisle, I think people can do a better job of critically thinking, but I also don't think it's necessarily individual people's faults, because again, it's just natural instinct to look at the loudest, craziest voice and to want to hear opinions that match with your own pre-existing opinions. It's hard to critically think about your beliefs, and it's even harder to admit that you're wrong. And that's something that we're all really bad at right now. And we could use a dose of coming to agreements and agreeing on a base level of reality and truth and facts. So again, just to reiterate, we have so much more conspiracy-minded thinking since social media started up, and that might not seem necessarily related to social media and like the political polarization that's been happening since, I don't know, 2015, 2016. I think it really, really is. And through the documentary and through some of the podcasts and websites that I've been researching, it seems like there is a correlation. Obviously, it's not causation. I'm not saying social media caused the political polarization, but it's really like added gasoline to the fire, I suppose. There was one quote that I really, really liked. Can't quite remember whether it was from, I think it was from the podcast, but it was, "Democracy depends on meaningful free will and not free will in quotes that's influenced and manipulated without our awareness of it." I just think that's really important to consider, because even though you might think that you have autonomy and free will, and that goes for buying the product that you saw advertised on Instagram, and it goes for clicking on that conspiracy theory video or that anorexia video or on that divisive post on Facebook, it's not actually your fault or your responsibility fully to exercise self-control and not click on those things. It is at least partially the responsibility of the platforms and the algorithm that are allowing that content to be placed before you, like a tempting treat that you want to click on because it's attention grabbing and it's addicting. Social media is supposed to give everyone a platform for their voice, and that is amazing. But there is such a thing as bad speech that's really harmful and really great at inciting violence and hatred and division. And there's speech that's also just categorically false. And the more that people from the outside try to point at that speech and say, "Hey, that's false, I'm trying to fact check you right now," the more people who have felt disenfranchised by one side of the political spectrum or the other will point and say, "Hey, no, because your fact checking is invalid, and I live on this other set of facts." That's when our social fabric starts to disintegrate and makes me really stressed out and stay up late at night thinking about it. It just is super degrading to our community and our society as a whole, and it's not just our country, it's globally a huge problem. But free speech is super important, but there's so much bad speech on the internet that it's too hard for us to counter all of that bad speech with counter arguments. That's how rhetoric is supposed to be critiqued and engaged with. You're supposed to hear what somebody has to say and you're supposed to respond. And whoever has the most logical, reasonable, rational argument should win, and we should believe that person. But when there's so much of this craziness and chaos and bad speech that we're not able to fact check everything, and even if we were, half of the country disagrees on what facts are true in the first place and is distrustful of all sorts of mediums for checking facts, then it's just chaos. And this literally affects every single person that's online, which is most of our country. And it's affecting you whether you know it or not. So I'm hoping that through watching this video, you'll know it a bit more and maybe be able to do something about it. Sorry, I have a lot to say and I'm saying it all really fast, so I hope that some of this is coming across as useful. Another issue is that our attention is finite and our attention spans are getting really short, and so people don't have the time and the energy to wade through counter arguments to arguments or beliefs that they find compelling on a first listen or read. So if they read a headline and they're like, "Yeah, I believe that," they won't be incentivized to read through or wade through an entire article to find out whether it actually makes sense logically, because they got everything they thought they needed from that single headline. And that's just not really the type of world that I want to live in, and hopefully you don't either, because it doesn't allow for nuance in any of our arguments. And yeah, the algorithm just doesn't value showing you differing views from your own, because keeping you in your personalized echo chamber is much more profitable to them, because you're more likely to stay engaged on Facebook if you're scrolling through a bunch of people's comments about a political issue that you agree with, because that's more fun. Like, that's more interesting, and it validates your ego and your point of view, and you want to keep looking at it. But if Facebook showed you things that you disagree with, you'd be like, ugh, I'm gonna put my phone down. I don't even want to see this. So we're living in the type of economy that values us looking at things that we already are pre-inclined to agree with, and us paying attention to only those things and not things that actually challenge our worldview at all. So if you're like me and you grew up with these platforms shaping your identity and how you think about the world, and even the generation just below me, if you've never known a world without the internet and without social media, it's going to be really hard to develop those critical thinking faculties that will allow you to parse out what is true and what is false. So things that we can do overall: companies can stop using algorithms that depend on capturing people's attention, and that way people get what they search for. If you look up how to bake a pie on YouTube, you'll get how to bake a pie and not some political scandal or the newest Kardashian news. You'll get what you actually want, and you'll preserve your autonomy. We can petition for the platforms to start heavily regulating their content, and that way we make sure that credible sources are prioritized over non-credible sources or sources that spout disinformation. And we can make sure that there are restrictions that restrict children viewing certain conspiracy theory type videos, or videos that will be super detrimental to their mental health, like the inspiration anorexia videos. I mean, I think this is a great idea in theory, but I think we're beyond this point, because the algorithm is controlling all of these factors, and the people that work at these companies, there's not nearly enough of them to be regulating every single video that every single person sees, because it's so personalized. And so I think this could be maybe a place to start, but it's definitely not the solution to the problem. And because of our political climate, if we heavily regulate the information that's being dispersed, then there's going to be accusations of free speech being limited, and it's going to be super problematic. It's a slippery slope, because if the regulators decide that the New York Times is credible, but a source like Steven Crowder on YouTube is not, then that could cause a huge backlash, and, you know, censorship issues are brought up, and it makes polarization worse in the long run. So that's difficult. I think the biggest thing is going to be a business model change, where attention is no longer the thing that's highest valued. And one way to make that happen would be paying for the sites that we're using or the platforms that we're using. In that scenario, you'll cut out the middleman of the sponsorships and the ad companies. I think that would be pretty reasonable. Like, you pay $15 a month for Spotify or for Netflix. Why wouldn't you pay a subscription fee for your social media in order to maintain the ethics and the values that we think are important in our society? One podcast that I'd like to mention is Sam Harris, because I really, really enjoy his podcast, and he actually has a platform like this. His podcast is called the Making Sense Podcast, and he asks his subscribers that can afford it to pay for the service of hearing his work, but he makes a caveat for people who can't afford it. They just have to write an email to him, and he'll give them the service for free. I think that's a really admirable business model. I think it would be really difficult on a larger scale, but I think it's definitely worth it, because you're not getting biased information. Your content is not being tainted or influenced at all by sponsorships and the capitalist aspect of society. Maybe the next step is also creating a new type of platform for social media, where it's possible for everybody to buy into it, or if they can't buy into it, for some sort of exception to be made for them upon a verification of their economic status, where you can connect with friends without compromising the content and without competing for attention with likes and for popularity and for validation, and without being manipulated by advertisers. So a sort of ethical new form of social media is what I would really champion. But those are things that are gonna be large-scale changes that aren't gonna happen overnight. So what can you do individually? I actually had to do a lot of research to figure out what things that people as individuals can do to start making a change. And the number one thing that I would say is delete apps that are toxic for you. So sit down and be really honest with yourself. Ask yourself if you're happier after you've spent hours of your time scrolling through Instagram or Twitter. For me personally, Instagram, Snapchat, and Twitter were toxic apps. I've never really used Facebook, and I have one right now. I check it like once a month maybe, and so that actually hasn't been a problem for me. So if there are apps like that for you, then feel free to keep using them, because obviously you're not drawn into the addictive cycle of them, and that's great. But I think most of the time that's the exception and not the rule. So since I've started this platform just over a month ago, I believe, in just a few comments with subscribers, I've had better conversations than I could have ever had on apps like Instagram. I feel like YouTube can facilitate really great connections being made in the sharing of knowledge and the sharing of information in a really useful, interesting way. And so I guess what I'm saying is be picky about the social media that you decide to keep, and be picky about how you use it. Because there are really detrimental things on YouTube, like I've mentioned, like conspiracy theories, or even videos that perpetuate the cycle of consumerism and capitalism, and sponsored videos because you're being influenced to buy things that you don't want or wouldn't otherwise need. But I think the internet and certain platforms has the ability to connect people in a meaningful way and move us forward and enhance our lives. With certain forms of media, we're limited to telling a story in a single picture or a single sentence, like with Instagram and Twitter or with Snapchat. But with certain other forms that are more long form friendly, like with YouTube, where I can make this video, which is probably gonna be a million hours long, I feel like we can get a lot further, learn a lot more. FaceTime, iMessage, or the Android equivalent of these, and phone calls, these things are tools for you to use, and using these things, you're not the product, which is, I think, the goal of a lot of technology. It makes our lives better, it makes connections easier. For me personally, VSCO is a really great app where you can share photos and see photos of people that you follow, but there are no likes and there's no follower count being displayed on your profile. So like for me, I've actually tried to go find like who I'm following or who's following me, and I don't think you can even find those, and there's no such thing as likes. So really, if you're posting, you're not getting that adrenaline rush, and you're also not getting that need to be validated through the likes and through comments and stuff. So it's more just about the love of posting photography mostly, and so I use it only for photography. It takes those most addictive aspects of Instagram out. So I highly recommend VSCO if you want something to sort of replace Instagram. It's a great place to post photos and also see beautiful photos. I've heard really good things about Marco Polo, which is another great social media app to connect with friends. I've never personally used it, but I think it's sort of like a group messaging thing, if I have got it right, so that's maybe something to try. Also Voxer, my lovely friend from back home, introduced me to it, and it's really amazing. You can send voice messages, basically like voicemails, to people directly. It's like texting, but even more in depth, because you can have a conversation, but it doesn't have to be synchronous. And so I can like send a reply to something that she said 2 weeks ago, and maybe in a couple weeks, if she has time, she can sit down and listen to my message and reply to that. And it's sort of just an ongoing conversation. I think a really great way to connect with friends, especially long distance, and you can have actual meaningful conversations. Another thing you can do is turn off your notifications, so you don't feel so much pressure in getting back to the apps. So maybe you're not ready to delete all of your social media yet, and this can apply to even things like email. Just turning off your notifications for them will keep your mind off of them for longer, which I think is always a good thing because it definitely will help you focus. You can track your screen time, and this is super easy to do. So there's also a couple of apps that I found on the website for the Center for Humane Technology. There's one called Moment, there's the Newsfeed Eradicator to help you reduce distractions, and there's Flipped to help you stay focused on your goals. Also, I think it's really important to check news sites whose perspectives you disagree with. And so there's this one site called All Sites, which gives readers a sort of cross-partisan view of world events. It is specifically designed to avoid clickbait and to avoid bias. There's a couple of other sites I can link as well that are supposed to be pretty unbiased news sources. Advanced level, this may have been the hardest thing for me, is to keep phones out of the bedroom. To be honest, I haven't been really great about this recently because it is such a habit, but I think this is a great thing to start doing, is creating a charging station outside of your bedroom so you leave your phone there overnight. The first thing you wake up to in the morning and the last thing you go to sleep to shouldn't be your phone. It should be your partner, or if you live alone, your thoughts, and maybe will allow you to jumpstart your creativity and have some more peace of mind and honestly help you sleep better. So there's a lot of perks to not having your phone with you at night and in the morning. Another thing to do is set boundaries. Limit yourself to like 30 minutes a day on any given platform. You can also blacklist certain websites from your computer. There's one tool called Freedom, which works for Mac and Windows. Also, distraction-free YouTube on Chrome. It removes recommended videos from the sidebar of YouTube, which makes you much less likely to get sucked into a rabbit hole. There's also a tool called uBlock Origin, which blocks content, ads, and tracking, which is super, super cool. Another thing that I think is really useful, if you can afford it, is upgrading your membership on platforms that provide meaningful content. So when you see, Wikipedia might not be a great example, but I do think that they're actually really useful. But if you see, like on the New York Times or the New Yorker or the Atlantic, they'll ask you to donate money. If you can, upgrade your membership or donate money to support journalism that is dedicated to fact-checking and to credible information. I think this is really, really key. And even with podcasts, like I mentioned the Sam Harris podcast, but I'm sure there's others where you can support them directly and you're basically paying for the type of business model that you want to experience. Another helpful tip is to eliminate outrage from your social media / online diet. And so if you're looking at a lot of divisive accounts on your social media, try unfollowing them. Also, like outrage-driven media I think is really problematic, and we see that with a lot of social media activists. And even though obviously it's great to voice your opinions, it's great to have your voice heard, it's also important not to incite further divisive and hateful thinking. And if anything, follow accounts and people who are devoted to being unbiased or to giving the other side a chance. Even just following people who are having really nuanced, in-depth conversation and giving your attention to those people rather than people who are spouting hate and negativity, I think can really help. Apparently for Twitter, there's a tool called iUnfollow, which can help you clean up who you're following and make intentional decisions about what content you will be receiving on that app. Same with Facebook. I mean, I think it's pretty easy to go through your Facebook groups and see if there's any groups that are outrage driven. And this also goes for very polarized media sites. Fox News comes to mind first, but also MSNBC. So I think on both sides of the spectrum, you get really polarizing and divisive speech that just really isn't that helpful. Let me know what you think below, but I think on both sides we can admit that there's news sources that are very outrage driven and are really just competing for our attention among all the other sources. Another note that I'd like to mention is just be compassionate and be kind. And rather than responding to somebody you disagree with directly, on Twitter, let's say, send them a direct message, or on Facebook and talk about the issue. And if it's a friend, talk about it over the phone or in person. Obviously, COVID restrictions apply, but I don't think outrage has to be performative. And just because you get the most angry about a social issue online, that doesn't mean that you're the most in the right. Maybe the best thing to do would be to handle the issue calmly and have a conversation that's productive one-on-one with someone. Here I think would be a good place to talk a little bit about YouTube, because I acknowledge the hypocrisy of this video and I feel like it's important to address since we're looking at this from all angles. So I think YouTube can be about having a tool and using it to empower yourself and educate yourself and grow. And despite the fact that there are pretty dangerous rabbit holes on YouTube, like I mentioned with the conspiracy theories, and by the way, there's a New York Times podcast called The Rabbit Hole, which is so good and really informative, and it's pretty much all about YouTube rabbit holes and unintentional content wells that people fall down. Also, like I mentioned, sponsored videos aren't that cool and targeted advertising isn't great either, but I think the trade-off can be really worth it. I think YouTube really allows for lengthy conversations with plenty of nuance, and other platforms don't really facilitate that at all. And when I watch a YouTube video of a political commentator that I don't necessarily agree with, I'm not just bristling at a clickbait headline and judging them based on a 20-second soundbite. I'm actually doing my best to comprehend their argument, and I'm finding places where our views actually converge. I think that's very, very productive.
I decided to end the video here because it was already so long, but I hope that you learned something and maybe even felt inspired to quit social media, or at least adjust your habits in using it. Thank you guys so much for watching. It means a lot to me. And don't forget to step outside today and appreciate this beautiful world we live in, because life is short. Why spend it worrying about things that don't matter? Catch you next time. Bye.